Welcome to NATA's Real Talk, where we discuss recent events in Washington and how they affect your aviation businesses. I'm your host, Ryan Wagasback, Senior Vice President at the National Air Transportation Association. And today, I'm joined by Alison Squiccimarro, an attorney from the law offices of Paul Lange. December 8th, the White House set a deadline for employees of federal contractors to get vaccinated against COVID-19. A mandate that will affect countless aviation businesses, but that has prompted countless questions as well, right? So first off, can you explain what makes a company qualify as a contractor or a subcontractor under this executive order?
So the order requires any contractor who has a contract-like instrument. So if they're issued purchase orders, if they're issued anything, they're going to likely fall under the contract-like instrument. So it's for services, construction, or leasehold interest, services covered under the Service Contract Act. Simply stated, government agencies are required to seek modifications to their contracts to include this government mandate and include this government vaccination requirement. If a contractor has a concern about it, they should be hearing from the agency. The agency should be requesting a modification to include this clause in their existing contract.
So fueling military aircraft would be an example. We've got a lot of ground handling FBOs or working with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. You would be in the queue, right, to be addressing this issue?
That's a question that's in a little bit of a gray area because there seems to be an exemption for manufacturing and there seems to be an exemption for provision of products. And the question I have is, does the supplying, if an FBO is only supplying fuel, isn't that the provision of a product? And if they're solely providing the product, if that's the way it's viewed, then they might not fall under the contractor mandate. The best course of action is for them to reach out to the agency that they have a contract with and ask, because it's incumbent on the agency to include this provision in their contract. So first line on this is reach out to the agency and get clarity over whether they're mandating it and they're going to include it in their contract.
For businesses that have multiple locations, right? So some of my locations may be working with government contracts. Does this require all of my employees, right, for all of the locations to need to get vaccinated under this order?
If you're only performing services on a government contract at one location, but you have a centralized billing department, you have centralized HR, you have a CEO, you have all the corporate infrastructure that supports that other location, you're probably going to have to vaccinate all of those employees.
Wow. Okay.
So if they're doing any support on it, and the big things are like a billing department, if the bill's issued from someplace else, then everyone at that other location where the bill's issued from needs to be vaccinated.
And then, of course, understanding the contracts that fall under the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000 are exempt from this executive order. Does that mean per year or over the course of the contract?
I think it's going to be on an annual basis. It is really going to be driven by, is there a request for modification to include a vaccine mandate?
Some of the other vaccine mandates coming down for private companies include an option for weekly testing in lieu of a vaccine. Is that an option for companies covered under the federal contractor order?
No, it's not. The only employees who are going to be able to be tested in lieu of receiving the vaccine are those employees who fall under a religious or medical exemption. So if you have a medical reason documented by your physician that you cannot receive the vaccine, then your employer will need to consider that and evaluate it and make a determination on whether or not you're eligible for an exemption. And the same goes for sincerely held religious beliefs. If you have a sincerely held religious belief that precludes you from being vaccinated, then you may be entitled to an exemption, and that'll be for the employer to work it out.
So we turn the news on and we continue to hear pilot unions and other industry trade groups. Retail trucking, for an example, have requested either more time to comply with this mandate or the option of course, weekly testing. What is the likelihood you think there will be any wiggle room?
So the information issued by the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force seems to indicate that there's a little bit of wiggle room. It gives the hiring agency, the contracting agency, the ability to grant a 60-day extension for urgent mission critical needs. So if the agency feels that the contractor falls within that parameter, the agency can go ahead, allow the work even though the full workforce is not vaccinated, and the requirement is that as long as within 60 days they are vaccinated. There's also some wiggle room. It's going to be policed by the agency. They're not going to be asking for the documentation. They're going to be asking, do you meet the requirements? And it's incumbent upon the contractor to make sure that they meet the requirements. It's going to be a little bit of a learning curve to get up to speed, and I think everyone's going to be challenged by that. So, with that comes inherently a little bit of wiggle room. Notwithstanding that, you should make best efforts to meet the requirements.
And so in closing, what is your advice for businesses who face the December 8th deadline? How can we prepare?
So I think that it's important for those businesses to implement a vaccination policy within their workforce, start evaluating medical and religious exemptions and considering those. And then if you have employees who simply refuse to be vaccinated, it's a really difficult time right now with workforce issues. So it's going to be a difficult decision for an employer to make a decision to terminate an employee because they don't want to be vaccinated. So I think that employer needs to really identify what their problem is. How big a problem is it? How many employees are we talking about? Survey, figure it out, and then look at alternatives. Is there any possibility that you could move that employee to another location where a government contract is not being performed, and that they're not a central location where everything's supporting that government contract, and the other location. But that's going to be something that's going to be tricky, and it's going to require a lot of movement. But if you can narrow your problem down to just a few employees, you might be able to do that by just looking at your other locations.
Well, fantastic information as always. Alison Squiccimarro from the law offices of Paul Lange. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Ryan.
There will be more information to come, so we'll be in touch very soon. Thank you.